I'm going to read to you a little bit of Rabbi Zeff's bio. He has a bachelor's degree in Hebrew language, a master's in Jewish history, and he received rabbinic ordination from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary of Yeshiva University. He has served as spiritual leader of congregations in LA, Sacramento. The Zeff family moved to Israel in 1994, where the rabbi has held senior positions in the field of yeshiva education. Concurrent with his rabbinic work, he has completed a doctorate in pastoral counseling and advanced training in team cognitive behavioral therapy, exploring the interface between psychology, spirituality, and ethics. Rabbi Zeff and his wife Donna, who's a wonderful person, are the proud parents of 9 children and grandparents to 12. Kol hakavod. Rabbi Dr. Zeff is well known as an unusually gifted speaker and teacher, compassionate, wise, for sure, and skilled pastoral counselor. So welcome, Rabbi Zeff. What a pleasure it is to have you with us.
Thank you. So I'm audible to everybody? Okay, great. So first of all, I want to thank Phil for putting this forum together. It's very exciting for me, and I hope it'll be enriching for all of us who are participating in this learning experience. And besides thanking Cantor Phil for putting this together, I also, David, no good.
The pleasures of working from home.
That's Rhea. She wants to participate too, but she only speaks dog. Okay, and in any case, so I'm sure you know this already, but as Canterfield just said, we've been studying for the past few years on a weekly basis, and we've been doing mostly Hasidic texts that tend to have a Kabbalistic basis and exploring those Hasidic Kabbalistic ideas. And I've gotten to know Canterfield over that time, and you truly are privileged. You probably know this already, to have Canterfield in your lives. And I'm going to say something that sounds a little cynical, but many clergy, one gets the impression that I think they went to theatrical school instead of rabbinical school, that there's sort of a lot of show and sort of theatrical performance. And Canterfield is not like that at all. He happens to come from an entertainment background, as I'm sure you know. But he's one of the most genuine clergy that I've ever met, who himself is involved in a very sincere and genuine spiritual journey, and hopes that you'll join him in humility, his humility, in his own spiritual journey, together trying to move forward to build a more meaningful and rich Jewish life. So I feel very blessed to have Canterfield in my life, and I want to thank Dennis Gura for making that introduction a few years ago. And I'm sure that everybody else appreciates that same unique quality about Canterfield. He also happens to have a pretty neat doggy at home, which some of you may have met. Okay. Now, I want to briefly introduce the approach we're going to take today and the topic. The approach we're going to take today is primarily textual. I don't know if you were able to download the text that were available. Just shake your head if you have a copy of the text. Okay, that's good news. Okay, I am very textually oriented, and that's for several reasons. One of them is because it grounds us in a sense of authenticity. You don't have to believe any. If I get up here and just start pontificating, then I just may be making up things off the top of my head. That's not what I'm interested in doing. I'm interested in engaging with Jewish tradition, our classic sacred texts that have developed over the past several thousand years. And by doing that, we participate in a very special dialogue, a dialogue between other personalities who came before us. They speak to us, and we speak to them back. And they lived in very different times. We're going to be encountering sources that were written 2,000 years ago, sources that were written 800 years ago, sources that were written 100 years ago. And we're going to meet those sources and those personalities, and we're going to speak back. We're going to have a dialogue that spans time, transcends time. As well, we're going to transcend place. We're going to be engaging in a dialogue with our sacred sources, some of them that came from the land of Israel, some of them came from Babylonia, some of them came from Spain, some of them came from Russia. Nothing that comes from the valley in LA, by the way. Maybe Canterville will speak up, but that'll be our living sacred text from Encino. So that's the magic of engaging in text study. It's that sense of authenticity and that sense of engaging in that ongoing dialogue of tradition, which transcends time and transcends place. Now, when we study text, there are two steps. One step is, what does the text say? First step, what does it mean? I want to just translate it and understand the idea. That's step number one. Step number two is, what does that mean to me personally? Do I agree? Do I disagree? Is it meaningful? Is it meaningless? That's a very different question than the first step, which is just try to understand what the author is trying to convey. Now, I see myself as a resource to be able to enable people to understand the text, to unlock these texts, which can often be cryptic and hard to understand, even in translation. And then the second step is, what do you do with that in terms of your own personal journey, your own lives, your own values, etc.? That's up to you. So in today's session, we're going to be primarily focusing on that first step, encountering those texts, wrestling with those texts. What does the text mean? What is it saying? Now, what do I think about it? How do I feel about it? That's for tomorrow. And Canterville has told me that his line will be open. You can contact him WhatsApp, cell phone, 24/7 to share with him how you actually process the messages that emerge from those texts. So tonight's primarily, what are these texts saying? Okay? And then as we process it on a personal level, what does it mean to me? So that's really something that's very individualized and very personal and can be very intimate. Now, what's our topic? I'll tell you one thing it's not: Donald Trump. Won't that be a breath of fresh air? I'm sure that many of you have realized that there's something very incongruent when one compares the Jewish spiritual path with that of our other sister religions. And just recently, just to illustrate this idea, Canterville and I were studying this Hasidic Kabbalistic text, and I don't even know how we got to this, but I sent him a YouTube video of the Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir singing its version of the Hallelujah Chorus. You might want to write this down. Search on YouTube, or Canterville can give you the link. Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir singing the Hallelujah Chorus. Now, the Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir is not the Valley Beth Shalom Choir, right? This is I guess, sort of an evangelical church that has the most magnificent choir. And this piece of music is so incredibly soulful, so incredibly powerful, and spiritually compelling that when I listen to it, and it's overtly Christian, but it doesn't matter. When I listen to it, it sends chills up and down my spine. And it actually makes me jealous. You see the people who are singing, and by the way, it's all amateurs. I don't think I told you this, Phil. The entire choir, they're all amateurs, and it's of magnificent quality. They sing so soulfully. They are so spiritually engaged and alive that I say, oh, can I, as a Jew, can I have just a little bit of that? Just send me through YouTube just a little bit of that spiritual energy. I'm jealous. Our tradition is ultra cognitive. Have you noticed this? What do? We study. They pray, we study. Now, of course, we also pray, right? But prayer should be as meaningful as possible. That's really Cantor Phil's, one of his great challenges, is to try to make prayer as meaningful as possible. But if you had to look at the broad spectrum of Jewish values, we have a Talmudic expression, which you may have heard, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. The study of Torah outweighs all of the other practices of Judaism. Now, that's pretty amazing. For us, the central religious experience is intellectual. But that presents a great challenge. What about our souls? What about a rich spiritual life? Is that something we have to just listen to the Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir to get? That would be pretty ironic and sad for us. Is there spiritual meaning in the act of the study of Torah? Is the study of Torah something in addition to being an intellectual cognitive experience? What I want to do in the next 45 minutes is explore classical texts, tease them out, see if we can pierce beyond the word and try to see the internal message. And I hope to get to a conclusion in the next 45 minutes, something a little bit non-intuitive and maybe surprising. And that is that the learning of Torah, if understood properly and approached with the right frame of mind, the right mindfulness, can be the supreme spiritual experience, the supreme encounter with divinity. Should we dig in? But first, I'll say l'chaim to everybody. L'chaim.
L'chaim on behalf of everyone.
Oh, good. Esther, l'chaim to you, and Susan. Okay. And everybody has their vodka, right? It's everybody's vodka? Okay, good. Okay, let's dig in. We're going to study a text from the Talmud. It asks a question, and it gives a very strange answer. It's going to take us a few minutes to figure out what the meaning of the answer is. But if we understand the answer properly, it's going to open up a window for us that I think will frame the experience of studying Torah in a very different way, a deeply spiritual way. Let's take a look at the first text there. I'm going to read it in Hebrew and then translate it, and also it's on your page in translation. Some of the text we'll read in Hebrew. I just like to do that because it feels good. But some of them, just for the sake of time, we'll write in English. The Talmud says the following: Minay levirkat Torah lefanecha min Torah. From where do we know in the Torah that there is a commandment to recite a blessing before we study Torah? That's the question the Talmud is asking. That where in the Torah is the source for the practice that we have to recite a blessing before studying Torah? Now, I don't know if this is something that you're familiar with. I've been involved in many different study contexts, including Melton adult education programs, some of you may be familiar with. And it's a very common practice, whether in Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, that before we engage in the study of Torah, that there's a blessing. I just want to show you what we're talking about so that you can orient yourself here. I have it printed here on the source sheet. If you just skip to page 5, and I have just printed from the prayer book, a traditional Siddur. This will hopefully sound familiar to you. I'll read it in Hebrew first. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddishanu mitzvot tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. That's the first sentence. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us to be involved with the words of Torah. So some of you may be familiar with this blessing, and it is Jewish tradition that before we study Torah, we make this blessing. Now, I just read you the first sentence. It's a little bit longer, and we'll discuss the other elements of that blessing in a few minutes. But it's important now to just say a word about blessings. You know, Jews say a lot of blessings. That's a very important element in Jewish tradition. There's actually a Talmudic statement that says that we should try to say 100 blessings every day, 100 blessings. Well, what's the idea of a blessing? Anybody who's spent time with Cantor Phil should really appreciate what a blessing is. It means that one approaches a certain activity, that we do it with mindfulness, with deep appreciation, with a spiritual preparedness. That's the function of a blessing. So whether it's a blessing before we drink a glass of wine, so we don't just gulp down the glass of wine. We say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri hagafen. Why? Because then consuming that glass of wine becomes a deeply spiritual experience. We don't take it for granted that we have a glass of wine. Not everybody has access to a glass of wine. What a gift from the divine. Obviously, if people have a problem with alcohol, we're not talking about that, right? But under normal circumstance, what a gift to be able to appreciate that gift and to realize what a privilege it is to be able to have this glass of wine with my meal. How wonderful that is. So that's what blessings are. So we make this blessing before studying the Torah in order to have a sense of mindfulness and appreciation for the deeper meaning of what it means to study Torah. Now, what that deeper meaning is, that's what we're going to be discussing. Now, the strange thing is, when the Talmud says, where in the Torah does it say you should make a blessing before studying Torah? The strange thing is the answer. So let's now go back to source number 1, and we're going to read the answer. So the Talmud now says, right, where in the Torah does it say make a blessing before studying the Torah? Shene'emar, as it says in the Torah itself, and it quotes from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, a verse. Now, generally speaking, if the Talmud were to say, for instance, how do we know you should make a blessing after eating a pastrami sandwich? So that's actually an explicit verse in the Torah. The Torah says explicitly in another place that you shall eat and be satiated and bless the Lord. Well, that's a very direct and explicit notion in the Torah of making a blessing after eating, the Birkat Hamazon, grace after meals. So when the Talmud says, where does it say in the Torah you should make a blessing before learning Torah? I would expect to find a verse someplace that says, and before you study Torah, make a blessing. Except that's not the answer. There is no verse that says that. Let's take a look at the verse which is indeed quoted. Hishem Hashem Ekra Havugodu Lelohenu. When I proclaim the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God. When I proclaim the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God. You're kidding. How? I don't even know what those words mean. I don't know what they mean in English. And what does that have to do with making a blessing before studying Torah? Words don't say that. Like I said, I don't know what those words say. So this is our great challenge in the next few minutes, is to try to figure out how the Talmud thinks that those words are telling us to make a blessing before we study Torah. Well, the first thing we have to do, just in terms of Talmudic methodology, whenever the Talmud quotes a verse, first thing you should do is look it up. Because often seeing the biblical context of that one verse will be very informative. So we're all going to look up that verse and take a look at its context. I did the work for you in terms of assembling the sources. So if you turn to page 2, And we're going to take a look at source number 2. You see it says Deuteronomy chapter 32 at the top. Okay, so let's take a look at that verse in its context. Torah says the following: Listen, O heavens, and I will speak, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth. By the way, the book of Deuteronomy is Moses' sort of parting speech to the Jewish people. His last words of wisdom and guidance and instruction before he's about to die, and the Jewish people will then enter the land of Israel under the leadership of Joshua. By the way, as a sort of irony, when Moses begins his career, God appears before him in the burning bush and says, go to Pharaoh in Egypt and tell him, let my people go. So if you remember, Moses does not accept this mission with great joy. And he actually says he's quite inadequate. And he says that he's got a speech defect. The only thing I can say is that by the end of the Torah, his speech defect apparently disappeared, because the book of Deuteronomy is many chapters of a long speech given by Moses. So that was a miracle. I guess he had a good speech therapist. And this is part of that speech. Listen, O heavens, and I will speak, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth. My lesson will drip like rain. My word will flow like dew, like storm winds on vegetation and like raindrops on grass. When I call out the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God. So that third verse, that's our verse. But when we look at it in context, now we can't do a whole analysis of those 3 verses there, but at least get the general idea. So Moses is addressing what? When he says, my lesson will drip like rain, my word will flow like dew, etc. Right? Listen, O heavens, and I will speak, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth. Moses is somehow describing what? His job as the giver of the Torah, right? My lesson, my word. So it is interesting that when you look up the verse in context, it is dealing with Moses' teaching, the Torah of Moshe. Moses' teaching. So this is getting us a little closer that at least we are dealing with the Torah here. It still doesn't help me very much to understand that one verse, which somehow is hinting at the idea that before one learns Torah, one makes a blessing. When I call out the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God. Okay, so everybody has to take a deep breath now, and maybe another l'chaim. Because now we're going to go deep. I found a late 19th century, early 20th century commentator. His name was Epstein. He died in Russia in 1908. And he tries to explain how that verse somehow, when I call out the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God, that's somehow telling us that we should make a blessing before studying Torah. He called his work Aruch HaShulchan. And he says the following, source number 3. For the Torah is the name of God. For the Torah is the name of God. Now look back at the verse. Source 2 in verse 3. When I call out the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God. And the author of this text is saying that name of the Lord is actually a way of referring to the Torah. So let's just take that phrase, name of the Lord, and stick in the word Torah instead, because the Torah is the name of God. We'll discuss what that means in a minute. When I call out the Torah equals the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God. Okay, we're getting closer. How does one ascribe greatness to God? By making a blessing. When I call out the name of the Lord is the Torah, make a blessing. Make a blessing. One more point. When it says, when I call out the name of the Lord, the Hebrew is ekra, to call out, ekra. But does anybody know what that same root in Hebrew, kuf resh aleph, koreh, it can mean to call out, but that same root, koreh, can also mean, does anybody know? You can actually unmute yourself and say it.
Esther's got it, I think.
Yeah.
Esther, go ahead and unmute.
Koreh?
To read.
Read, beautiful. Thank you, Esther. That's a beautiful name you have. So it means to read. So now, instead of translating it like here, when I call out the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God, you could actually translate it instead of when I call it, when I read. When I read the name of the Lord. And what did that rabbi tell us from Russia? That name of the Lord, that's another way of referring to the Torah. The Torah is the name of God. When I call out, meaning when I read, when I study the name of the Lord, which is the Torah, make a blessing first, ascribe greatness to our God. So we sort of solved the puzzle in a certain sense. And that is, we can see how that verse, if you decipher it, that you say the name of the Lord is actually a reference to Torah. When I call out should really be translated as when I read or study, and ascribe greatness to our God means make a blessing. So we've sort of solved the problem technically. But what does that mean? What does it mean to say that the Torah is God's name? The Torah is God's name. Well, that rabbi who said the Torah is God's name, where did he get that idea from? By the way, we're part of this chain of tradition. I had alluded to that in my prefatory remarks. Almost everybody's quoting something else and interpreting it. What is he quoting? He's quoting the Zohar. The Zohar is the classic text of Kabbalah, the classic text of Jewish mysticism. Now, don't get scared. We're only going to study one sentence of it, and we're going to try to make some sense of it. Let's take a look at that passage in the Zohar, the great text of Kabbalah, which is the source of the idea that the Torah is God's name. So source number 4, the Zohar says the following: the entire Torah is the holy name. For there's no word in the Torah that is not included in the holy name. The Torah is God's name. Okay, so now I see the source of that idea. I still have no clue what that could possibly mean, that the Torah is God's name. Just to make things even more confusing, by the way, I think it's a great exercise, and it's not artificial. It's the nature of life. To get very confused and frustrated first. And then we become enlightened, or at least Phil does. So I want to show you another Kabbalistic text, which cites the Zohar and teases it out a little bit, but you'll see it's very cryptic. This is Nachmanides, Ramban. Now don't confuse Rambam, Maimonides, with Ramban, Nachmanides. The great Maimonides was a very rationalist philosopher from the 12th century in Spain. Ramban, Nachmanides, was a great Kabbalist, very different in temperament and spiritual approach than Maimonides, also from Spain. Nachmanides, Ramban, that we're going to be studying right now, he ultimately moved to the land of Israel, 13th century. In the 13th century, made Aliyah. It's a little easier to make Aliyah nowadays. 13th century was a challenge, and he moved to the city of Akko. Has anybody ever been to Acre, Akko, in Israel? It's an amazing crusader fortress there. Very worth your while next time you're in Israel to visit there. I have a daughter who lives in Akko. So Ramban says the following. We have yet another mystic, this is source number 5 on page 3, top of page 3. We have yet another mystical tradition that the whole Torah is comprised of names of the Holy One, blessed be He, and that the letters of the words separate themselves into divine names when divided in a different manner. This is mystical, but you can see how he's quoting the Zohar, the Torah is God's name. He actually suggests that there was a kind of primal Torah. Before the Torah that we have nowadays, there was a primal Torah. There were no spaces between the letters. It was just one long string of letters with no spaces. So it could be divided up into words differently than we have nowadays. It sort of looked like computer code. All of the Torah from the beginning to the end was this string of letters, this sort of computer code. And that string of letters was God's name. God's name. And he quotes a Talmudic tradition. It would appear that the Torah, written with letters of black fire upon a background of white fire, was in this form we have mentioned. We have a Talmudic tradition that the Torah was black fire upon white fire. That's not the Torah you have at Valley Beth Shalom, right? This is some kind of mystical Torah that is the precursor to the Torah we have nowadays. And Ramban goes on to explain that the Torah we have nowadays is a kind of translation, as it were, of the primordial mystical Torah, which is God's name. In order for the Torah to be more overtly meaningful to us, it had to be divided up into words that we could understand, that tell stories, that convey wisdom, etc. So the Torah we have nowadays, we'll call that the normative Torah, is a kind of morphing of what was the mystical black fire on white fire, all the letters together in one kind of mystical code, which is God's name. Okay. Where does this leave us? Confused. I see the source of this idea of the Torah is God's name. I see it developed a little bit by Ramban, Nachmanides. But what does that mean? What does that really mean? What does it mean to say the Torah is God's name? So what I want to do now is take a step back. And I want to understand on a deeper level, what is a name? What is a name? There's something so special. I'm so glad that we're doing this through Zoom, because then I can say, hi, Jack and Michelle and Dennis and Susan and Sherry and Nanette and Mark and Elaine and Gloria and Esther and Cantor Phil. You have names. I want to look at one of the very first passages in the Torah which discusses names and try to figure out what's going on there. And for this, I'm just going to, we'll read a little bit and then paraphrase a little bit. Let's take a look at source number 6. And the Lord God said, it is not good, very famous passage. It is not good that man be alone. I shall make him a helpmate opposite him. So we'll just take this at face value. We could spend a lot of time discussing this passage, but we're not going to, because I just want to distill one message out of it. I'm going to be a little bit silly, if you don't mind. God takes a look at Adam. He looks pretty depressed. He's alone. Now, what should God's response be? Well, find him a significant other, right? Right away, we should hear the story about the creation of Chava, of Eve. That should be the next passage, but it's not. It's a very bizarre sequence of verses. Because right after God says, you look really depressed. And obviously, you need a partner in life. So instead of taking care of that, God says, Oi, I forgot something before I find you a wife. You know, I've got all these animals I created and they don't have names. Would you mind naming them? So the Torah describes that God brings all these animals to Adam and he gives them names. And then after that's done, God says, oh, yeah, your problem that you're lonely. Okay. And he puts him under general anesthesia and removes part of his body. And it's Eve. And Adam says, well, I'll be a monkey's uncle. This is amazing. This time she is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And they lived happily ever after. I'm not so sure about the happily ever after part, but that's the narrative. Now, that's a very strange sequence because there's a recognition of the profound lowliness of Adam. Then there's naming of the animals, non sequitur. What's that have to do with anything? And then there is returning to the theme of we have to create a couple here that are going to journey through life together. Eve is created. What is that naming? Now, I'm going to be a little silly, but it's clearly the message of the Torah. The naming is not irrelevant to the main theme, which is Adam's loneliness and an attempt at curing that. Have you ever been in a hotel lobby in Jerusalem? So I'm going to describe what you will see. You will see very nicely dressed young ultra-Orthodox Jews. Fellow has a nice suit on, a nice black hat, and there's a young woman sitting there, and she's dressed up very nicely. So this is how it works in the ultra-Orthodox world, that they're arranged marriages. Now, they usually meet before they get married. And they meet and make sure that there's some compatibility. Now, they don't go out for 6 months and live together for 6 years and then get married, right? That's not the way it works in that world. I am so glad that I met my wife in college. Can you imagine? You're going to have to go to the Jerusalem Hilton lobby, and you're going to, over a cup of tea, they don't have much money, these couples, have a cup of tea, and they're going to have a 2-hour discussion and figure out whether they should get married or not. Maybe they'll go out once or twice more, but that's how it works. Can you imagine that incredible pressure? Well, that's essentially what was going on with Adam. Adam's very forlorn. He needs a significant other. Well, let's bring in the candidates. So Adam is sitting there in the Jerusalem Hilton Hotel in the lobby. And in comes the first candidate, a giraffe. And they have a cup of tea together. God calls him afterwards, knew how to go. Adam said, too tall. Okay, we'll try again tomorrow. Brings in a lioness. God calls him up after they had their cup of tea. How was it? Too intimidating. And so on and so forth. I'm being facetious, but that's actually what's going on. I'm not making this up because I want to show you how I'm making up I'm making it, try to keep you awake. That I'm making up. But in terms of the narrative, so take a look at in that source 6, verse 20. And man named all the cattle and the fowl of the heavens and all the beasts of the field. But for man, he did not find a helpmate opposite him. That naming was the process of finding a mate. And then if you turn the page to page 4, then it says, and the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon him and did the surgical procedure. And then verse 23, this time she's bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, etc. Right? So the naming of the animals was part of the process of finding a partner to journey with in life. But why is it called naming? Why didn't it just say God made an introduction between Adam and a giraffe? Now we can understand what naming is. Naming is an attempt at capturing on some level the essence. When that couple sits down for 2 hours in the lobby of the Jerusalem Hilton Hotel, that's a very big challenge, but somehow in those 2 hours, they have to get a sense of who that other person is and decide if there's compatibility. For Adam, it was much more mystical. When Adam called names to these different animals, that name captured on some level the essence of what that other being was. And that's why when he named all the animals and captured their essence, got to know them on a deep level, gave them a name. The name is capturing the essence. It makes a profound connection. He realized none of them are suitable for him. Can you imagine how depressed he was by the time he had named every animal on the planet? I actually know some human beings that feel like they've gone out with every possible potential mate on the planet. That's very depressing. And of course, God played such a good trick on him. Now, Adam, in this moment of despair that he'll never find a soulmate, and then he meets Eve, and he says, wow, this time she is bone of my flesh, my flesh. She is my soulmate. Okay? So naming is capturing of essence. The name is a reflection of essence. I want to take a step back and get real for a moment. When a few minutes ago, I named some of your names, which luckily are on the screen, it means a lot to me to be able to call you by name. There's something very frustrating when I teach a group of people that I've never met them before. I have no idea what their names are. But there's something about being able to say, Elaine, I like your comment. It was beautiful, it's so meaningful to me. And Sherry, wow. What a blessing to have you in this learning experience. And Esther, wow. You even knew what the word Koreh means. There's something about using the name which allows for connection. It personalizes it. I want to go a little bit deeper with this idea. Now, a lot of people I see here are in the same age range as me, Cantor Phil. And you may remember there used to be that's not an insult, by the way. It's very good to be this age. You notice how wise you feel? Along with the backache. We have wisdom of life. There used to be a hobby, ham radio operator. Does anybody know what this is? It has nothing to do with ham. This is a kosher class here, no ham. But there used to be this hobby that is completely outdated, even there are some people actually strangely enough do it. I mean, we're talking, we have Russia online here. We have Los Angeles. We have near Dana Point. You know, I'm in Israel, right? But it used to be that didn't have internet, and people would have these ham radios that you could broadcast and make connections all over the world. And people had these huge antennas on the roofs of their houses, and people would like keep a record of, wow, I was able to connect to another ham radio operator in Moscow, or in China, or, and they would keep a record of that. That was sort of like this tremendous hobby people had. Now, ham radio operators, this hobby, they had a name that they used on air, right? They didn't call themselves Joel, right? They had a name, right? Tiger, make up a name. I don't know if anybody knows what that was called. It's called a handle. In ham radio speak, your name was called a handle. And I think that's a very powerful idea. What's a handle? A handle enables me to grab onto something, to access it. So if I have a mug of coffee and I want to hold it, I can hold it, but it might be very hot, but it has a handle. When I hold that handle, it allows me to grasp that mug. And when I hold that handle, the mug is attached to that handle. That's a name. A name is a handle. A name is a way for me to hold another person. A name is a way of accessing the other. The name is a way that somehow, in some way, that we perhaps mystically expresses on some level essence. You know that according to Jewish tradition, when we're given a name, our parents had, at least for that moment, a kind of prophetic power. The Holy Spirit, Ruach HaKodesh in Hebrew. That it's not arbitrary, right? Esther is really Esther. There's something about Esther which is really Esther. You know, the word Esther actually means hidden. I can see it. There's something deep in there that's hidden away. Okay, that's Esther. Okay, and so on and so forth. The name is an expression of essence. The name is the way that we can access another person, that otherwise, without that name, there's disconnect. Now I want to go back. When we say that the Torah is God's name, can you see where this is going? That's what the Zohar, this great work of Kabbalah, is saying. The Torah is God's name. I want to try to appreciate this. Jews have a challenge. We're very insistent that God is not physical. That's very important to us. God is not a person. God is the root of all existence. That is the source of all being. That transcends the material world. How do we, as material human beings, we're all material, except for Michelle Barron, who's an angel, but most of us are, we're stuff, right? Flesh and blood. We're things. How do we somehow access the divine, which transcends material existence? God's name. Because our tradition is telling us that God loves us so much that he wants to have a relationship with us, but not by becoming a person. That's a different religion. By sharing with us his name, the Torah. The Torah is God's wisdom and will put into a form that we can access. That's God's name. When we study Torah, we're able to grasp God and connect. We're able to contemplate his wisdom and will, that divine wisdom and will, and connect through his name. Name is connection. Name is expression of essence. That's what that verse meant in the Talmud. When I read the name of God, the Torah, make a blessing. Do something first so that we understand this is not just an intellectual activity. This is not just a cognitive experience. That I'm having an intimate relationship with God, that God created us for a relationship, a living relationship, by sharing himself with us through his name, through Torah. Through Torah, we come to know God to the extent that we can, through his revealing to us his wisdom and will. Now, what I want to do is examine the words of that blessing a little bit more closely. And it's printed in every prayer book, I would imagine. I haven't checked every prayer book, but I would imagine. Look in page number 5, source number 9. So these are the words. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments. We could spend a lot of time on this. What does sanctified mean, etc.? You know, king, how do you deal with that metaphor, right? We're not so used to that image. Phil will take care of that tomorrow. Who has sanctified us with the commandments and commanded us to be involved with words of Torah. By the way, it's interesting. It doesn't say to study the Torah. It says to be involved with. The Hebrew is la'asok. La'asok means to be involved with. Because learning Torah is not just a cerebral intellectual experience. It's a whole being engagement, la'asok. I'm hugging God, and he's hugging me. And the divine is hugging me. It's a divine embrace. We'll see in just a minute or two, we're going to go one step deeper mystically to see just how intimate that experience is. And then the blessing goes on. And please, Lord our God, make the words of your Torah sweet. The Hebrew really is sweet, not pleasant. Sweet in our mouths and in the mouths of all your people, the house of Israel. We actually ask God, make this so enjoyable. Help me to feel the pleasure and joy of this intimate moment. Because it's through this act of engaging in Torah that I meet you. I hold on to you. I know your name. And may we and our offspring and the offspring of our offspring and the offspring of your people, the house of Israel, all of us, be knowing of your name. Knowing of your name. That's the Torah, the name of God. Knowing of your name. And studying your Torah for its own sake. Blessed are you, Lord, who teaches Torah to his people Israel. And then the blessing ends with the feeling of gratitude that God gave us the Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has chosen us from all nations, given us his Torah. How fortunate we are. Blessed are you, God, who gives the Torah. Fine. Now I want to go a little bit deeper. Do you have a little more energy? Okay, get ready for this. We only have a few more minutes, so I'm just going to paraphrase, but I am not making this up. So it's source number 10, which is in Hebrew on page 5 and 6, and then page 6 is the English. It's a very long text. And you'll study it on your own, but I just want to focus on one aspect of it. This is a Hasidic Kabbalistic text written by one of the great leaders, spiritual masters of the Hasidic movement, Rabbi Shner Zalman of Ladi. And he died in 1813 in Russia. The work is popularly called Tanya. Some of you may have heard of it. Some of you may be studying it, like Dennis has a weekly class in Tanya. I want to share with you the gist of this incredible chapter here from that book. We talked about the study of Torah is the way we have a relationship with God. It's his name. By him sharing with us his wisdom, his mind. The Torah is God's mind. What does it mean to get to know somebody? I want to know what you're thinking. I want to know what you're feeling. I want what's important to you. What are your values? That's a real relationship. That's what happens when we study Torah. But it's much deeper than that. And that's what we're going to discover right now. The author points out something amazing. We're going to contrast doing a mitzvah with studying Torah. Now, it happens to be that studying Torah is also a mitzvah, but it's very different. Why? Let's say that I light Shabbat candles. Beautiful mitzvah. I light Shabbat candles. When I do that mitzvah, my hand, after I light Shabbat candles, it's the same hand as it was before I lit Shabbat candles. I used my capacity for action, my hand, to do a sacred act of lighting Shabbat candles, bringing light into the world. Beautiful message. But my hand is the same hand. That's not true of learning. When you learn something, we're taking something that we didn't know before, and I hope this happened today, and that idea that one learned, you know where it is now after you learn it? It used to be out there. When one learns an idea, it's actually in one's mind now, literally. You now have placed something in your mind, in your brain. And this, by the way, it's not just an abstract idea. This is true scientifically. When I was in college, I at first wanted to be a physician for all the wrong reasons, because my father was. And then I decided I'm too lazy to become a doctor just because my father was a doctor and you help people, you make a living, etc. I need to do something that my heart is passionate about. And that was our tradition, studying it and sharing it with others. But I took all the pre-med classes. And I took a class in neurobiology. And I learned about something called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity, plastic means something can be molded. This is, you probably heard this idea before. It's absolutely true. The neurons, those nerve cells which make up our mind, they change shape. Circuits are created and circuits are changed. That's why, by the way, people who are interested in addiction, that's a very important theme. We actually create certain kinds of circuitry through certain behaviors and even thoughts that create certain patterns of behavior that are hard to break. But through great effort, those circuits can be changed. When we learn something, we actually change the neural structure of our mind. I'll give you an image, which is not scientifically true, but it's useful. You know that nerve cells, these neurons, you know what they look like? They look like a snake. They're long and skinny, kind of like I would like to be, long and skinny. And have you ever seen a snake eat a mouse? So my wife happens to love snakes and used to be the nature instructor in Camp Ramah in Ojai, California. And she had these snakes, not poisonous snakes, for the kids to play with. I have no interest in snakes. On the contrary, they kind of freak me out. She would feed these mice to the snakes. And then you would see the snake would have like this hump right in the middle of it. And it would digest that mouse. It would take a while to digest it. But imagine that snake with that hump in it. That's what your neuron looks like. And imagine that hump being a piece of information. When one learns something, one is internalizing knowledge, which enters into that neuron and is absorbed. That's what happens when we learn something. So in contrast to doing an action of a mitzvah, lighting Shabbat candles, where my hand is the same. When you learn something, your mind is different now. Your mind has literally internalized those words of, in this case, Torah. The Torah is literally inside your mind. Now, if the Torah is divine wisdom, now I'm going to go one step further. Don't ask me any questions about this next sentence. It's very Kabbalistic. When we talk about a human being, we can make a distinction between their wisdom and the person. You can have a very smart person who knows everything about English literature or ethics, but is a jerk of their personal life. A lot of people like that out there. You can make a distinction between a person's mind and who they are, what they know and who they are. With God, God is a perfect unity. God's wisdom is God. There's no distinction. There's no distinction between God and his wisdom. This is a very hard idea to understand. This is something we will discuss at another learning session. But God and his wisdom, God and the Torah are one. If we internalize the wisdom of the Torah into our minds, it's now inside. We're learning. And now we have these Torah ideas in our minds. You know what's inside our mind right now? The divine. And what's the space, the gap between the idea in our mind and our mind? No gap. It's a perfect merger. The idea that's now in our mind is part and parcel of our mind. They're one. If that idea is divinity, it's the divine wisdom, it's God. When we internalize that idea, we are actually in a state of unity with the divine. It's not just that we're uttering his name. It's not just a closeness. It's a merger of us with God. The Torah is God's name, and it happens to be that in this particular case, there's no distinction between God's name and God. It's all one. And we internalize that Torah in our mind. We are in a state of unity. I want to show you one sentence. Turn to page 7. Let's look at this Kabbalistic Hasidic text. I want to just look at the second paragraph on page 7. This is a wonderful union, like which there is none other, and which has no parallel anywhere in the material world, where complete oneness and unity from every side and angle can be attained. When I hold this cup, that's a very intimate relationship. Close, got the cup, hold my hand, but they're not one. When we study Torah, and the Torah is God's name, it's God's will and wisdom, and we internalize it in our mind, we are in a state of perfect unity with the divine at that moment. And I would go so far as to say, he uses a word in the Hebrew text, yichud. Yichud means unity, from the word echad, one. But yichud is also used in Hebrew as an expression of intimacy, sexual intimacy. When we study Torah and we internalize that divine wisdom, we are experiencing a state of intimacy with God. Learning Torah is making love with God in a way which is more intimate than two people making love. When two people make love, they're close, but they're not literally one. When we internalize the divine will and wisdom, we are literally one, not just close, but one. The idea is internal to our minds and one with our minds, and that idea is divinity. The study of Torah is the supreme spiritual experience. It is making love with the divine. And that is why the Talmud says, before one learns Torah, make sure we don't just see this as some kind of cognitive, interesting experience. We need to have a sense of mindfulness that when we learn Torah, it is an incredible privilege to get to know God, and more than that, to internalize the divine will and wisdom, which is God, into our very being. And at that moment, experience that special intimacy, that loving relationship with the divine. And that is why in Jewish tradition, the learning of Torah becomes the supreme value, even in some ways more than prayer, because it's through that act of learning Torah that we experience that unique moment of intimacy and oneness with the source of all being. Thank you for joining me today in this adventure. I enjoyed it. I hope that it was meaningful to you. And Phil, thank you again. Phil, if you'd make my email known to, you could send it out, and anybody has any questions or comments, I'd be delighted to engage with you.
Absolutely. What a wonderful journey you took us on today. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. God bless you all.
Thank you all for joining today. That was just wonderful. I personally don't have a whole lot of time for comments, but I would love to, just unmuted everybody. At least I'm trying to unmute all. Okay. I'm hoping that in the coming weeks we can take a moment to review some of what we learned today and unpack that. You know, I've been speaking a lot about God's name and what does that mean, and I think we have a great opportunity now to talk about it together. So I hope everyone enjoyed today. And the idea is that periodically, maybe over the next months, maybe once a month, have either Rabbi Zeff or a guest speaker of some kind, where we can, you know, engage both our hearts and our minds. Usually we try to quiet our minds and allow our spiritual nature to come to the fore. And here, today's was a beautiful example of how you do both. And that's exactly what the lesson was, that by engaging our intellectual side, which we all have a great deal of, how do you put that into a spiritual context? And in terms of mindfulness, I think you couldn't have a better example of that than today. Yeah. So thank you all so much for being on this. Of course, Gloria, thank you. And we will see you all, let's see, what is today? Thursday. Sunday evening at 7. We'll be back on track for a couple of weeks, at least to the middle of second week of July. I think I'll be away a little bit, but until then, let's stay together and learn together. So thank you all very much.
So Cantor Baron, you're going to send us his email?
Yes, I will send it out to everyone on this call. I made a record of who's on. And anyone who wants to study with Rabbi Zeff, by the way, he's a wonderful teacher one-on-one. You know, that's always, a group is great, but one-on-one is really very special. And you can pick any sort of stream of learning that you want to do with him. His knowledge is extremely broad, as Dennis will tell you. And I'm sure, Dennis, you've studied many different streams over the years with him. So any questions you have would be.
I've studied all over the place with him. What you saw today is completely typical of the way he teaches and his approach. And he is very cued in on when we study one-on-one, and I've seen him in other group settings, he's always very cued in. So if you're looking for a rabbinic teacher, I cannot more heartily recommend anybody than Rabbi Zeff.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So thank you, folks.
Thank you.
See you all soon.
Bye.